Hi everyone, I'm Jana, and this work was done in collaboration with my co-first author Ayman Gaba, as well as our other wonderful co-authors, Jason Chung, Marie Schwackel, and Kyle Hall, and our advisors, Yuri Brun and Cindy Zhang Bearfield. Imagine you have some money that you would like to invest, and you're looking for a financial advisor to help you out with that. You end up with two options, both of whom are robots and both of whom are pretty good. One of them returns on average a 50% profit to its clients, and the other a 70% profit. All else equal, consider which of these two robots you'd rather work with. Intuitively, you may want to work with the 70% robot because it will give you more money. But what if I told you that this robot has been known to exhibit sexist behavior in the past? Would you be willing to sacrifice 20% of possible profit to work with a non-sexist robot? On the other hand, would you risk possible sexism for the potential to make more money? This is not just a hypothetical scenario. Robot investors do exist, and people are actually using them. In fact, machine learning models are used in a variety of high-impact domains, and in the financial domain, they're used to make decisions like how much interest to charge or who should be given a loan. And because they learn from real-world data, they also learn the biases embedded within real-world decisions, meaning they can exhibit bias as well. And so we ask the question, what factors impact which of these robots a person would choose to work with? Is it the profit they return? Is it the amount of bias that the sexist one exhibits? Or maybe it's the characteristics of the decision maker themselves, like their gender or their tendency to trust. Or maybe it's the way that the models are presented to the decision maker in the first place. We conducted a series of studies where participants were asked to choose between a fair and a biased investor model. Then we asked several research questions regarding the factors that influence participants to choose one model or the other. One of these was the effect of the gender of the participant. Another was the effect of the way model information was presented to the participant. And a third was the effect of explicitly labeling a model as sexist. Let's look at the effect of gender first. We wondered whether different user demographics would affect the way participants interacted with the models. Given that our bias was gender-based, we particularly wondered whether men and women would have significantly different choice patterns. In our surveys, everyone sees two models at a time, a fair model A and an unfair model B. There are also two conditions. In one condition, the unfair model favors women, and in the other condition, the unfair model favors men. And we found that men and women exhibited different choice patterns across both of these conditions. Here you can see a chart showing the percentage of participants choosing the fair model separated by men and women across different levels of bias, or model sexism. The line on top represents results for women, and you can see that this line is significantly above the line representing results for men, and the lines never cross, indicating to us that women chose the fair model more often than men consistently across different levels of bias. But let's walk through the chart a little bit. First, keep in mind that we're looking at results for the condition where the bias model is sexist against the participant. On the x-axis, you can see the amount of bias, or sexism, in the form of difference in return to men and women. The more sexist a model is, the more it returns to the other gender, and the less it returns to yours. On the y-axis, you can see the percentage of participants choosing the fair model. We want to note that we recognize that gender is not binary. Here we present a line, the middle line, with some preliminary results for non-binary people. Our number of non-binary participants was not enough to draw conclusions from this data, but we wanted to highlight that in our observations, their behavior did differ from those identifying as men and women. We would love to more explicitly explore a larger gender spectrum in future work, but for now, we'll present our results for participants identifying as men and women. We saw that women switched to choosing the fair model consistently a majority of the time at an earlier point than men. A model needed to be more sexist in order to convince men participants to choose the fair model. So for the effect of gender, we find that women trusted fair models more often than men did consistently. And in fact, what we observed was fairly consistent with previous work, which shows that personal experiences inform user perceptions of data, and, at least according to neoclassical economics, people tend to try to maximize their profits regardless of others. So we can see that participants may have different perceptions of the presented models and subsequently have different choice patterns. We wondered as well whether the way that the models are described to participants could affect their perceptions and their decisions. So each participant was presented with one of two types of model representations: a text representation and one of the most common visualization types, bar charts. And we found that presentation of model information did affect participant choices. Let's again take a look at our results. Here we can see a chart in the same style as before, with the x-axis representing the level of bias or difference in return between men and women, and the y-axis representing the percentage of participants choosing the fair model. And again, we are looking at the case where the bias model is sexist against the participant. The line on top represents those who saw text, and we can see that this line is consistently and significantly above the line for those who saw bar charts. Those who saw text representations also switched to consistently choosing the fair model the majority of the time earlier than those who saw bar charts, meaning the bias needed to be more pronounced in order for people to choose the fair model when reading bar charts, indicating to us that participants were consistently more likely to choose the fair model when information was presented as text. In order to check the generalizability of our results, we tested across different styles of bar charts and saw similar choice patterns across these styles, as well as testing across different styles of text representations and seeing similar choice patterns across these as well. This suggests generalizability between different variations of these two representations. So again, we can see that different participants may have different perceptions of the presented information. But we wondered, what were these different perceptions that may be driving our observations? Specifically, what reasoning were participants using when making their decisions? We randomly distributed free response questions asking for participants' reasoning throughout our surveys, and performed an inductive thematic analysis to identify several strategies that people were using. One of these strategies was the delta strategy, where participants looked at differences between model returns and often focused on equality or fairness. Another was the self-profit strategy, where participants chose whichever model gave them more money. Then there was the average strategy, where participants looked for the higher overall average, and the personal belief strategy, where participants used information or beliefs outside the scope of model descriptions. But let's take a look at the two strategies most associated with choosing the fair or the unfair model, delta and self-profit. We saw that participants chose the delta strategy more often when presented with text, and the self-profit strategy more often when presented with bar charts. As existing work has shown, explicitly shown numbers facilitate difference computations, while bar charts draw attention to salient large values. This may also be why we saw that the delta strategy was more predictive of selecting the fair model, while the self-profit strategy was more predictive of selecting the bias model. Finally, we saw that women used the delta strategy more often than men did. However, we make no causal conclusions from this data, and future work should look more into whether there is a causal relationship between strategy and choices. So, for the effect of presentation, we find that presentation does affect participant choices, and participants were more likely to choose the fair model when presented with text. This finding corroborates existing work, which shows that visualization design impacts interpretation, decisions, and reasoning strategies. Check out these related works for more. So, we can see that people react differently to bar charts than text. What if we combine these two things and just outright tell participants that one of the models is sexist? Can we mitigate some of the bias we've seen in people's behavior and push them to choose the fair model more often? As you've seen, our original presentation included no explicit labels. And we found that when we placed explicit labels on the unfair model, participants chose the fair model more often. Interestingly, when we placed explicit labels on the fair model, and keep in mind that this would be inconsistent with what participants were seeing from model return data, participants chose the fair model less often. So we find that both label types affected participant choices, and in fact, participants trusted explicit labels over visual evidence. This is again consistent with previous work, which has shown that annotations can impact data comprehension and user preferences, and visualization text has a significant effect on what a person remembers about a visualization. Let's quickly go over our main findings. We observed that women trusted fair models more often than men did. Participants were more likely to choose fair models when presented with text than with bar charts, and Participants trusted explicit labels over visual evidence. All right, now that we've got these interesting findings, so what? Well, we sat down and thought hard about how these findings should affect you when designing visualizations communicating information about machine learning models. And we've got 3 actionable recommendations for designers. First, design matters, so consider your design's possible impact on decision makers. Second, every stakeholder who looks at a visualization has a relationship to the decision they'll be making, so account for those relationships. And finally, use explicit warnings with caution. To read more about our findings and our study methodology in detail, please read our paper. Thank you for listening.